Shalom, and welcome to Ahavah H'Torah's Lovers of the Word. This week's study is centered on the final 5 chapters of the book of Exodus, Shemot. In this study, we will talk about the tabernacle, the contributions for the tabernacle, and the implementations of that, the importance of the building a house for God in our lives, and also the importance of not forgetting to take a rest for ourselves, to rebuild our bodies and our minds so that we can do the work of the Lord. So please come with me as we join the study already in progress. Shalom. This week's study concludes the reading of the book of Exodus. In the final passage of that book, it tells us, "The cloud that covered the tent of meeting, the glory of God filled the sanctuary. For the cloud of God would be on the sanctuary before the eyes of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys." The book of Exodus begins with the narrative of the Jews' enslavement in Egypt. It recounts the story of their redemption and tells us of the giving of the Torah and the construction of the sanctuary. It is a story of constant growth. Following the atonement of physical freedom, they proceeded to Sinai, where God gave them the Torah, and they witnessed the revelation of spiritual truth. At Sinai, every person experienced a direct bond with God. This enabled them to a path of life that made possible a connection with God that none had ever experienced before. Now, the unique thing about the book of Exodus, as opposed to any other book of the Torah, is the fact that Exodus truly comes from the essence of the book. The book's name in the Hebrew is not the same equivalent as the name used in English, which comes from the Greek. Exodus means to leave something, to go away from something, to go out and not return. And the children of Israel did this. They went out. And they were not to return to Egypt, even though many times in their grumblings and complainings, they recanted over and over, "It would have been better had we died in Egypt. Were there no graves for us in Egypt?" So in their contemplations of self-grandizement, they pined for slavery. It's a sad truth, but many times we run into similar situations in our own lives, within our own communities of faith. But the reality is that the book of Exodus in the Hebrew, its name is Shemot. And that name means it is the book of names. See, their names were now recorded in the book of life. See, because this was the journey. The Exodus from Egypt was not the end. That was not the goal. The Exodus from Egypt was the beginning. It was the start of the promises that God had for his people. Just in the same way that when we come to salvation through Messiah Yeshua, he redeems us from the world that is Mitzrayim, the house of bondage. That is Egypt. And it is not the end of our story. It's not, woohoo, he's in, we got another one in the kingdom. And we rubber stamp that and we think, oh, put another notch in the belt for the pastor or the rabbi, and there we go. No, this is the start of the journey of the believer. Now they have to be discipled. Now they have to walk in the word and the teachings of the Lord, and they have to go forward and experience God's instruction firsthand. Its blessings and its curses. Its rewards and its consequences. Okay? So every person at Sinai experienced a direct bond with God. This enabled them on a path of life, made possible only with a connection with God. Not only on a mountain in the desert, but within the day-to-day realities of ordinary life. What do you mean by that, Rabbi? What are you talking about when you say not only when they saw the cloud of glory, but in the day-to-day realities? Well, in our life, in our day-to-day life, it's our interactions with one another. Remember, as Moses And the children of Israel were standing there, and they heard all the thunderings and the lightnings, and they felt all this stuff, and they got the 10 commandments from the Lord. Before Moses went up on the mountain for those 40 days and nights and disappeared behind the veil to spend time for the Lord, interceding for the people and receiving the rest of the commands, God gave Moses a specific set of commands to tell the children of Israel before he went up the mountain why he was gone. Okay? And these come in the portion Mishpatim. And these are a whole list of things that in our eyes can sometimes seem boring. Things like if your ox gores another person, or your animal hurts another animal, that you have to pay restitution for the animal plus 20%, and all of these things on how to treat your neighbor, on how to treat things you borrow, on how to lend, on how to treat servants, and so on and so on. What it is God wants you to be better than everybody else. He's talking about fairness. Remember, He is the God of justice. And what's the thing that primal in all man is when we're children? We go, oh, it's not fair. I'm not happy. I've been taken advantage of. And God is a God of fairness, and He's wanting us to be fair or upright in our deeds. This is why He gave the people these commands before Moses went up on the mountain, because He knew what their hearts were like. He knew they would be tempted to turn away from Him. So He gave them a specific set of instructions. I believe there's 53 instructions in the Parshat Mishpatim for them to observe why Moses was away for 40 days. So even if they wanted to focus on one instruction per day, they still would have had more than they needed for the 40 days he was gone. Okay? So that's important to remember. And the same in our own lives. God wants us to realize that we don't just sit at the mountain of the Lord waiting for His experience and getting all the goosebumps and the pimply things and, oh, this is so great, I'm in the presence of the Lord, and that's a wonderful thing. But we're not supposed to stay there. The whole purpose in God showing us His awesomeness is so we will actually listen to His words. And if we listen to Him, we are then commanded to do His words. We are supposed to carry His Shekinah, His glory, to others. And if we don't ever leave the presence of the Lord or the foot of the mountain to go out and experience and interact with others, we can never share the awesomeness of His glory or the fairness of His word. Okay? What's more, the spiritual awareness is given concrete expression through the construction of the sanctuary. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the sanctuary, because here we are in the book of Shemot. In the first half of it, it records their exodus from Egypt. But it's really interesting. About the time you get right at the Mount Sinai and you have the thunderings and the lightnings and Moses goes up, he doesn't go up there and God says, okay, now I'm going to give you this long list of instructions for the people so that they will walk in my ways and obey my commands to their fullness, and they will know that I alone am God. No, that is not what's happening here. What's happening here is the minute he gets up there, the first thing God does is He changes focus, and He says this. He says, take from among the people a contribution, each one as their hearts are moved to generosity towards me. And with these contributions, He gives him a list of everything that's acceptable to receive as gifts. This is gold and silver and copper and fine linen and wool and leather, the tashak skins, and so on and so on. And with these items, build for me a house, a dwelling place, a sanctuary, a mishkan, so that I might dwell with the children of Israel. This is an important thing, because not only is God willing to come down to earth, but this is a restoration of something that was lost. And I think everybody misses the imagery here. Do you realize that the first time that we hear the word for angels, of cherubim, the six-winged angels that are mentioned in the Bible, the book of Ezekiel, Isaiah, so on and so on, the first time we hear that word is in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, when Adam and Havah are exiled from the garden, the place where they dwelt with the Lord, when they walked in His presence. And these angels, these cheruvim were placed at the gates. And they were there with flaming swords, and they served one purpose, one on each side, of course. They served one purpose, and that was to keep people from entering back into the gate, for fear that they might eat of the tree of life and then live forever in their fallen state. Now, what was their fallen state? Their fallen state is because of their trespass, because of their sin, their disobedience to the simple commands God had given us into the garden, which there were only two. One was to be fruitful and to multiply, and the second was to simply not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But once we did that, something changed. Sin crept into the world. The light that glowed from the inside of man died out. And these angels were set there as guards to keep man from entering back into God's dwelling place in his impure state. Now, what you have to realize is when you look at this design of the tabernacle, this way that God designed the tabernacle with its stages and its courtyards, you have the outer courtyard, you have the holy place, you have the Holy of Holies, and so on and so on. These stages, these gates, were gates of purity. And the people had to come to certain levels of purity in order to pass into the next gate. Not because they might in some way profane God, quite the contrary. So that the presence of God would not destroy them. Because sin cannot stand in the presence of the Lord. Now here's the beautiful imagery. The second time in the Torah that we hear the word cheruvim is in the description of the Mishkan, the sanctuary that God once created. And what he does is he has them embroidered on what? On the veils, the curtains, the gates, entering into the courtyard. Now the outer walls of the courtyard are all white linen, beautiful, representing purity. But that main gate that they pass through, it is a gate constructed by embroiderers and weavers. And it consists of red, blue, purple, and gold, all woven together into a beautiful tapestry. And there are cherubim woven into this tapestry. It's specific that the cherubim are on this tapestry. What's more, the cherubim are woven into the coverings for the Mishkan itself, where the holy place and the Holy of Holies are. And then the cherubim are shown up yet again in a third spot. That is the gate, the curtain, the Pkudei, between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And then the fourth time the cherubim show up in the Mishkan imagery is two cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And this time, God gets specific about the placement of these cherubim. See, no longer are the cherubim like they were at the Garden of Eden, standing with flaming swords, guarding the gates, denying entrance into the presence of God, with God. But now they are upon the mercy seat, with their faces turned towards each other and their eyes looking down onto what? The mercy seat. Their wings covering the top of the mercy seat in glory. See, they're knelt down now like servants, like a canopy, like a covering for the presence of the Lord. And this is where the people's atonement was to be sprinkled each year. See, God is now creating a path back into fellowship with him. That was a path which was denied at the expulsion from the garden. These people are getting an opportunity and a way back into paradise. And this is what this Mishkan is to represent. The gates of God and the process that an individual goes to become purified as they walk in until they get to the mercy seat of the Father. This is a visual diagram of the walk of a believer as they go through life from their initial redemption, and they go through the patterns of experiencing God's blessings and his curses for obedience. And as they become purified and they become righteous and they are able to enter into the holy place, eventually, at a state of purity can walk into the Holy of Holies. And you know what happened when that happens? We have a beautiful example of that with Moshe, Moses, the lawgiver, the one who instructs the people, who God gives us vision for this tabernacle. When he goes into the tent of meeting and he is in the divine presence of God and he is conversing with God, it says, Pnei a pnei, face to face, like a man would with a friend. The only person in the mortal coil that could sit in the presence of the Lord and talk face to face. What happened when he came out of that place? He glowed. The glory of the Lord was on his countenance so much, his radiance, that he had to be veiled because the sight scared the people. Now this is important for us to understand, because what was it like for Adam and Ahavah in the garden? They glowed. They had an internal radiance. The Spirit lived within them. The Ruach HaKodesh. The Shekinah of the Lord was on their outer countenance. They didn't need clothes. But the minute that they sinned and the Ruach left them, they realized that they were naked, that they were empty, that they needed a covering. And that's what we experience with sacrifice and offerings, is a covering and atonement for our shortcomings. The sadness is many times the things that we seek to do, the atonements and the coverings that we seek to branch out towards God, are not enough to bring us back to the full restoration of the place we were at in the beginning. We actually have a lower status because we are now bearing the scars of our iniquities, the consequences of our disobedience. However, God has provided a way that not only will we make full atonement someday, but we will actually end up being better by going through this process than we would have been if we never had. So there is a overall plan of God. There is a reason for us to walk through this. See, God could have took the children of Israel to the promised land in 2 weeks. They could have walked right in. He could have moved everything out of the past, just like he parted the waters, and he could have said, here's your land. But what would have happened to the land if people would not have been trained to know how to take care of it? They would not even have been trained to be nice to one another, and there would have been wars, and they would have decimated each other, and in the end it would have been a horrible thing. And this is why when great blessings are poured out upon people who aren't prepared to contain it, many times we have examples like that in our present culture with the lottery system. Somebody who is an average Joe that's just struggling to make ends meet and wins millions of dollars, and they win the lottery and they go on these splurges, and there's everybody there to manipulate, twist, and distort for these folks, and they don't have good counsel. They don't have an understanding on what to do with all this that's been given to them. And many times this very thing that they thought was a blessing, that was the cure to all their problems, actually destroys their lives and their families, and sometimes even leads to their ultimate destruction and death. And they become a tragedy instead of a victory. The entire wanderings in the desert were for that purpose, so that Israel would not be a tragedy. That in the end, we have to realize that the book of Deuteronomy and at the end of Revelations, it's Israel who is upright before the Lord. It is Israel whose names are engraved upon the gates of the holy heavenly city as it comes down at the end of the age, the millennial reign of the kingdom upon this earth. It's the 12 sons of Israel that these gates are. They're nobody else. They're not some replacement theology that comes into it. In the end, we are promised by Moses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy that Israel will have ascended to righteousness. It will no longer be called Israel, but it will be called Yeshurun. And he uses that as he prophesies at the future redemption of the people. Now, it's important for us to notice that this sanctuary is not just a building of stone, wood, silver, gold, and those are the things that upon this earth are most precious to us, are the most precious materials. But that of itself is not the purpose. There's something greater here. That this sanctuary, this dwelling place, was that the people could experience God directly in their midst. And why is that important? Well, first of all, God was going to be taking these people on a journey. In this journey, they were going to be going through and they were going to be taught the ways of the Lord, and they were going to be tested in those ways. And this is what we have in the 38 years of the wanderings after they leave Mount Sinai. But what happens is who are they led by? They're led by Moses. Now, we already have experienced several times that even though Moses had delivered the children of Israel with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and he had the staff of God like he parted the waters, that many times the people attributed this power to Moses, like he was some kind of a magician or whatever, working his magic voodoo stuff to make things happen. And that was not the case. We understand that he was clearly following the direction of the Lord. It's real easy at times in our modern days for people to go, oh, well, that's just his thing. You know, that's not God's thing. God didn't say that to him. How do they know? They were not privy in that discussion between the Lord and that individual. That is a person's intimate time with the Lord. But God removed that possibility with the children of Israel by putting his tent of meeting right in the middle of the camp of the children of Israel during their wanderings, and his physical glory manifesting in the cloud of glory descending down upon the tabernacle in a way that was so great that they could not even stand on their own feet in its presence. And Moses would enter into the tent when the cloud would descend upon it, and they all witnessed this, and he would go in there. And when the cloud lifted and Moses came out, his face glowed, and it would have to be veiled. They couldn't even look upon it. It radiated so much. You know, it's funny because we sit here that many times we think, oh, you know, I felt the tingle of God in service today, and it's just a wonderful thing. And when the glory of God shines upon you, it doesn't make other people smile. And many times it does just the opposite. We see an example in the New Testament when Stephen is given his testimony when he's being brought out and they're getting ready to stone him, and he gives the testimony of Messiah there, and his face glows, it says in the text. And what happens to those around them? They didn't say, oh my gosh, his face is glowing, this man must be speaking the truth, the Spirit of God is in on. We must put down our stones and listen to Stephen. No, that's not at all what happened. Quite the opposite. They got enraged, their hearts were vehemently turned against him, and they stoned him to death. That is what happens many times to the prophets. Joseph was speaking for the Lord, and what did his brothers do to him? Dropped him down a well. It's important for us to realize that sometimes when God shows us things, no matter how true it is and how perfect it is, it's not always going to be received by those around us, even though it's the truth, even though it's the perfect will of God. But that's okay, because you know who it is that's commanding you. And it's more important to be obedient to the Lord than to be subservient to the wills of little kings, little men, who want to make for themselves kingdoms of their own making, pharaohs, heads of their own houses, and not servants in the Lord's. This is important for us to understand. Because Moses went in there, and the fact that he came back out, that the words that he would share with the people, they knew where it was coming from. That they weren't the words of Moses, but they were the words of the living God. The living God. Now, this is the important part about this living God. So, they had this thing. They didn't stop there. They didn't call out to all the nations around them, hey, come to Sinai. You know, the Lord had us build this gorgeous tabernacle. You should experience His presence. If we get the whole world to come here to this tabernacle, it will change your lives. That's not at all what happened. What happened was God lifted the cloud of glory and it moved. And they had to take this house that they built for His presence, and they had to tear it down, take it back apart, follow the cloud of glory, and where His cloud of glory stops, and they had to set it back up. That's not an easy task. Think about that for an instance. Think about if every time you got in your car and the GPS came on and told you you need to go here, 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 So you get in your car and you drive, and you stop, and then your car falls apart, and then next time the thing comes on to tell you to go someplace else, you have to put your car back together. So you can move, and go to the next place. It's over and over and over again. So this was not an easy process. Many times God does the same thing in our lives. He takes us from glory to glory. His cloud moves. He asks us to come follow. We have to pick up our stuff, and we have to follow after him. We have to be mobile. We'll break it all down, put it in our bags, load up our donkeys, our mules, and follow the Lord's presence. And when it stops, then we have to unpack, set it all back up again, and we're there until God tells us otherwise. See, we are to dwell with the Lord, not to settle down with the Lord. Okay? We have to be mobile. Divine service, because of this, we can make the statement, divine service requires progress. What are you saying, Rabbi? What I'm saying is that if you are a servant of the Most High God, He is going to require that you do something. And that what you do will stretch you many times. You can't just rest upon your tuchus, but you must instead continually undertake new and greater goals. Just as God is infinite and unbound, so too our relationship with Him knows no limitations. That's an important statement for us to understand. Now, the awesome thing about this, centered right in the middle of this message, is that we can get so busy doing the good work. Because remember, the children of Israel were busy doing the good work. They were building the sanctuary for God. Praise God, there's nothing greater than that. In fact, when God asked them to do the contributions started. Now, imagine what happened was they started with a trinkle. A few people stepped forward and started to give, which is just, this is normal, typical. And then others saw that. And then their hearts were moved, well, I can't be undone by Joe over here. I got to jump on this bandwagon. So then they go over and then they give their contribution. And everybody starts, and then everybody wants to get in the picture because they want to look like they're on board there, and it's in unity. The children of Israel were moved, and they gave in unity. And it gained momentum, so much so that the very people who were working on the tabernacle, that were taking the contributions, went to Moses and said, look, they're bringing too much stuff. We've got more than enough gold. We've got more than enough silver, more than enough thing. And right now, we need you to tell them to stop because it's actually getting in the way of the work. Many times we talk about the work, and what we do not often hear is that we have too much to accomplish the task at hand. Usually it's quite the opposite. We'd say, well, we have limited finances, we have limited resources, we don't have enough people, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough time. But the reality is many times we have too much stuff. Because what happens is when you have too much stuff, you can't do the things that God wants you to do. Because you're too busy taking care of the stuff. So one of the things they had to do is they had to tell the people to stop bringing stuff so they could focus on the work at hand, not get off track. And that's important for us to remember, not to get off track. Also, it became important that right after these commandments, God reiterated the commandments of the Shabbat. And He gave certain commandments that they were to rest. They were supposed to cease from their labors. Now, this doesn't mean that what they were doing wasn't good. It's just the simple fact that no matter how good it is that what you are doing, you still have to have rest. You have to have downtime. If you don't get any rest, you're going to suffer burnout. And this happens many times in ministry. People get fired up and they're going 3, 4, 5 times a week. Everything's going and they forget to rest. And then, or spend time with their wives and their children, and they don't stay home, and the next thing you know, their marriage is falling apart, and their children are falling apart, and they don't understand why. It's because they're out of balance. They put too much effort in one area, and they neglected others. And God never wants us to put all of our effort in one area and neglect everything else. That is why he gave us 2 tablets. One is our relationship with God. The other is our relationship with our fellow man, our brothers and sisters. Okay? It's important for us to remember that Shekhan is the word in Hebrew for a neighbor. Mishkan is the house next door. And God had this dwelling place built. It was so that he would be a neighbor to the people, that his door would be open. So the Shabbat is the blessing, is one of the greatest blessings that God has given us. The ability to rest every 6 days of work and 1 day of rest, in the same pattern that he gave us at the very creation and foundation of the world. Okay? It is one of the greatest paradoxes of life, of faith, as it concerns our need for a work for the living, to make a living. If God is the source of all blessing, then why do we even have to toil to earn a livelihood? And if we do work, how can we avoid the thought that this is our labor alone that produced these material results? See, there's a term in our culture here in the United States where people go, well, that guy over there, he's a self-made man. He made that business from nothing. He was, maybe he was an immigrant, he was a poor man, or he was raised with nothing, and he got out there and he hustled and he put in the work and the effort, and now look where he's at. Well, that's great. He put in 110% effort, but God still had to bless it for it to bear fruit. No matter how hard a farmer plants seed, no matter how hard a farmer turns the soil, he cannot control the rain and the sun. He cannot nurture those plants to bear fruit. Only the providence of God can control nature to give that man and his efforts a harvest, an ingathering. So, when the person who takes in the harvest and the ingathering has this great wealth, it's important that they do not think that they alone, with their own efforts, did this and get puffed up with pride. It's important that they realize that what they have is a gift from God's open and abundance for their efforts. It's a reward. Not only for the purpose of filling their coffers and taking care of their households and provision for their family, but for the entire community that they come into fellowship with. Because every single person that they come into contact with is their brother and sister, is their neighbor, their Shekhan. Okay? So the person who is given much, much is required. And in ancient Israel, the real tzaddiks with the inheritance, these men are like Boaz. They gave to the poor. They lifted up the sick. They took in the widows and the orphans. And they became a blessing to everyone in their communities. Okay? So there is Boazes out there in this world that God has for the very purpose of taking care of others. If you're a Boaz, I want you to understand that God has blessed you and that you are a blessing. And that's an awesome place to be in the body of Messiah. But in our culture, we tend to get obsessed with our work as if it defines us by who we are or by what we do. When the reality is it's not what we do, but it's what we've done that produced the reward. What we do at any given time is where we are in the presence. Where we are at the present time, not in the action. When we are in Shabbat, we are not working. Our mind should not be upon our work from the 6 days of the week. Our mind should be upon higher things. Our mind and our deeds and our words should be upon the Lord. We are there to fellowship with Him and rest and receive nourishment for our souls and our bodies. The awesome thing about this week's reading at the end of Shemot is that through this redemption process, when we get to this process, when the people are constructing the tabernacle, there is one image that we are shown that is greater than any other image in the book of Shemot, because no time in the book of Shemot are the people ever in this stage until the end of it. And that is that the people are in unity. The Torah tells us how Moses commanded the people to build the sanctuary in the desert, and how the people eagerly responded, and they gived and they participated. This portion's name, Vayakhel, actually means, and he gathered, or he assembled. A double-fold meaning. He gathered in the contributions, but he assembled the people. You can't have one without the other. And it begins relating that Moses, the power of God, brought everybody together in fellowship with one another. When building a sanctuary where godliness will be revealed, one must establish unity among the people. In our houses of prayer and our houses of study, if we want God's presence to manifest, if we want unity, God to be revealed, then we must establish unity within the people. Any house that is divided in vision, thought, actions, or words will not have the presence of God openly revealed within it. It'll be a house of contention. And nothing is more grievous to God when people meaningfully divide the blessings of the Lord. How does this happen? How do we get ourselves in this state? How can we take something so beautiful and so wonderful when people are unified in one simple purpose and create a house that's divided? That happens on a personal level. It happens when the individual puts up fences. And sometimes subgroups or cliques put up fences and walls to keep people out. The Spirit of God is hampered when people put walls between them and other people. That's important for us to understand. There are individuals who pride themselves on their spiritual sensitivity and refinement, and these people must reflect better and more encompassing in their relationships on how they experience their fellow man. You cannot be a spiritual person. You cannot be a godly person and stand there and hate your brother. It doesn't matter what you do. If you walk on water and you perform miracles and you speak with the tongues of angels, you can sing beautifully. But if you hate your brother in your heart, you're nothing. Paul tells us that if you do not have love, you are nothing but a clanging cymbal. And there's nothing more annoying than a clanging cymbal that's clanging inappropriately. My wife can pick up all kinds of little sounds and they become annoyances to her. And she'll, oh, don't you hear that? Something's banging. We'll be studying something, we'll be reading, and some little annoyance in the distance is going tink, 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 tink. And it'll drive her batty until we go deal with it. I'm going to ask that you would allow yourself to be so spiritually sensitive that if there's a tinging in your community, in your thing, you hear this tink, 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 that you get up and you go deal with it. Because the reality is if you don't deal with it when it's the small tinging, it's going to turn into a big tinging and it's going to cause some destruction. And there's going to be a cost for that division. Personal fences. We, even in our hurt, damaged state, sometimes we're angry, we're upset with people, or we've been wronged or whatever. But we cannot allow those things that have happened in the past to keep us from letting people back into our lives and our hearts and to love other people. Okay? Personal fences must come down for us to work in unity. We must practice the practical act of self-transcendence. Okay? we must transcend ourselves in relations with others. Establish togetherness. There's a beautiful Hasidic story. It's a simple one. It's a simple story, but I think it illustrates it perfectly. Once there was a rabbi, an older gentleman. He was trotting down a country road, and he passed by a wagon, and its wheels were mired in mud. It was stuck. The driver of the wagon calls out to the rabbi. He says, "Help me push the wagon out." The rabbi, realizing that he was weak and frail and old, said to himself, "Well, I can't be much assistance." So he tells the man, "I would like to help you, but I can't." The man with the wagon looked at the rabbi and he says, "Oh, but Rabbi, you can. You just don't want to." What did he mean by that? What lesson can we get from this story? The lesson is that even though it may not be obvious to us, it was obvious to the rabbi that he thought what was needed was somebody to give an extra push to the wagon. But he didn't feel that he had the ability to do that, so he didn't even try. If God brings, I want to tell you this, if God brings something to your attention and there's a need, the reason why he's bringing it to your attention is because you do have the ability to do something about it. Even this rabbi, this old man, could have done something to help this person whose cart was stuck in the mud. Maybe he could have grabbed the reins of his donkey or his oxen that was pulling the cart and helped guide him out as the man pushed. Maybe he could have called and got somebody down the road to come back and help the man. There was something he could have done. Because that would have took effort. He just did a quick assumption and thought, "I'd like to help you." But I want to ask you to guard yourself from being in situations where you say to your brother or your sister, "I'd like to help you," but because all that "but" is your tuchus, and that means that you are sitting on your butt and you're not willing to do anything. Okay? It is an illusion to think that you don't have the power to do it. No matter what your spiritual level is, you always have the potential for growth and achievement. Every person has a soul. And a part of every person's nephesh, there is an actual part of God, a spark of life hidden deep within their soul. And just like there is nothing that can hold God back, there is nothing that can hold us back, no matter what our circumstances or situation we find ourselves in. There is always something we can do to help. That should be encouraging to us, because we have to realize that the whole purpose for God taking them out of Egypt was not to take them to Sinai, give them the Torah, and build a tabernacle. If that had been the purpose, they never would have left. That's where they would have been. He gave them those tools so they could actually do the thing which the purpose was in the beginning, to take them to the promised land. But not so they could just go to the promised land and dwell like their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, but so they could go into the promised land and rule. They could go in and conquer. It would be given to them as a nation of priests and kings, a holy people, which is the true intent of what God tells us. We're getting ready to go into Vayakhel, and the whole purpose, the whole center focus on the entire book of Vayakhel is that we become a holy people, a holy nation, a nation of kings and priests. And God is going to give us a way to become that. So it's important for us to realize that when we go through this process of redemption and we see and we experience the glory of God, that He is simply empowering us to move forward, to look into the future on the horizon, because there is a greater redemption that's going to come. See, Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection was not the goal of the Torah. I'm not out to step on anybody's toes, but I'm telling you, the purpose was not just so that he would be crucified and resurrected. We look in the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh and the rest of the Brit Hadashah, and what we see is the final redemption, the full redemption at the end of the age, when not only will the Messiah be death, burial, and resurrection, but he will be a king. And the word of the Lord will go out from his holy place in Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The lion will lay down with the lamb. There will no longer be war. There will no longer be tears. There will no longer be hunger. There will no longer be poverty. We will have full restoration. The world will be a paradise like it was designed to be. And the Messiah will be our king. And we will be a world of kings and priests, servants with God. And then we get a new mission, a new purpose in the Olam Haba, the world to come, which hasn't even been written yet. We're just trying to get to the doorway, to the next thing that God has for us. He's just been trying to get us ready for that task. And that's where we find ourselves, looking to the future. So I will say this to you. No matter where you are in your personal walk, whether you think you've came into your promised land or not, you're not done. There is a purpose. We are still heading towards the kingdom of God. When the people left Egypt, they left Egypt in one day. But the verse in the Torah does not say that. The verse in the Torah says, as in the days of your exodus from Egypt, I will show you wonders. This is the prophecy that comes in the prophets. The days there is pluralized, denoting that it wasn't just the act of the Exodus, but it was the entire process that they went through. It took 2 years for the 10 plagues to come down, for God to judge Egypt, and for the Israelites to be freed. It took 2 years, not one day. We get always focused on the one day. We get focused on the victory. It's like in football when we watch the Super Bowl and we cheer for the winner. It took all season to get to that game, to build that team to that point to where they could become champions. It didn't happen in one game. They had to go through all these tests and these hurdles, and they had to circumvent, and they had to come back. Sometimes these winners are the wild cards. These are the guys that barely slipped in, but they end up at the end being the victors. Many times we ourselves are the wild cards. We stumble, we're having a hard time during the season, but we make it into the playoffs. And then we make it past that into the championship. And then we make it to the final game. God is saying that even though you stumble, even though that you have hard times, that He is not done with you, and that you alone can be victorious in your task in life. The future redemption should be our goal, not our previous one. God's already taken us out of Egypt. Now let's get busy working towards building His kingdom here upon the earth. Let us realize that God's full design for us is that we would be a holy people, able to walk into His presence, and that we would carry His light, like Moses, back out and share it with others. As you go this week, be cognizant of all the opportunities that you have to share God's light with other people. Be encouraged. God bless. Shalom, and thank you for joining us for this week's study on the final 5 chapters of the book of Exodus. I would like to encourage you as you go out into the work week to set apart a place and to take a moment and build a sanctuary for God within your own lives, that on a daily basis You enter into his presence so that God can fill you up, so that you can be a blessing and share the light of the Lord as you go out into your daily deeds with your neighbors, and your brothers, your sisters, and all the people you come in contact with. I would just like to give you a word of encouragement at that as we end each and every one of the 5 books of the Torah, that you go out with this axiom: Chazak, Chazak, Ve'anit Chazak. Be strong, and let us be strengthened. God bless.